The Barrow Keeper, a tale of the forgotten hills. There are places in the world where the dead do not rest easy, and the living have learned not to tread. The Hollow Hills were such a place, a stretch of moorland in the forgotten corners of the northern realm, where ancient burial mounds rose like the humped backs of sleeping giants, and the wind carried voices that had been silent for 1,000 years. The people of the lowlands knew better than to speak of the hills after dark. Mothers hushed children who asked about the lights sometimes seen dancing among the barrows. Farmers would walk miles out of their way rather than cross the old stone bridge that led into that cursed country. And travelers who ignored the warnings, sometimes never returned at all. But someone had to watch. The tradition was older than memory, passed down through generations like a hereditary curse. In each generation, one soul would be chosen, or would choose themselves, to serve as the Barrow Keeper. They would take up residence in the stone cottage at the edge of the hills, maintain the wards and boundaries, and ensure that what lay buried in those ancient mounds stayed buried. For 23 years, that duty had belonged to a man named Aldric Thorne. He had been young when he took the position, barely 20 summers, with the ink still fresh on his studies at the monastery school. He had thought himself brave, answering the call when the previous keeper had died. He had thought he understood what the role would demand. He had been wrong. Now, as autumn settled over the moorland and the 43rd year of his life drew toward its close, Aldric stood at the window of his cottage and watched the fog roll in from the east. It came every night at this time of year, thick and gray and utterly unnatural in the way it moved, flowing uphill, curling around certain barrows while avoiding others, responding to rules that had nothing to do with wind or weather. Behind him, the fire crackled in the hearth, but it did little to warm the chill that had settled into his bones. That chill had nothing to do with the season. It was the cold of old places and older things, the cold of graves and the spaces between heartbeats. He had felt it for so long now that he could barely remember what true warmth felt like. "It's gonna be a bad night," he said aloud, though there was no one to hear him. Speaking helped sometimes, kept the silence from pressing too close. "The fog's early, 3 hours before sunset, and already it's thick enough to hide the nearest mounds." He turned from the window and surveyed his cottage with the practiced eye of a man who had learned to notice details. Everything was in its place. The iron poker beside the fireplace, the rowan wood staff leaning in the corner, the leather satchel packed with salt and silver and other things less easily named. On the table lay his journal, the leather cover worn smooth by years of handling, filled with his careful observations and records. 23 years of observations, 23 years of nights when things moved in the fog, 23 years of keeping watch. He was so tired. But tired or not, the work didn't end. As the sun touched the horizon and the world began its slide into darkness, Aldric took up his staff and his satchel and stepped out into the dying light. The air was immediately colder outside, and the fog wrapped around him like grasping fingers. He had learned long ago not to flinch from it. Fear was a luxury he couldn't afford. Not here, not in this work. Fear made you hesitate, and hesitation could be fatal. He followed the path he had walked 10,000 times before, a circuit that took him around the perimeter of the hills, checking the boundary stones and the iron markers that had been set into the earth centuries ago by hands now dust. Each stone had to be inspected, each marker touched, to ensure the old enchantments still held. It was monotonous work, but monotony was its own kind of blessing. Monotony meant nothing had changed, nothing had broken through. Monotony meant the dead were still dead. But tonight, as Aldric approached the third marker on his circuit, an iron post driven deep into the ground at the edge of what locals called the King's Barrow, he felt something wrong. The iron was cold. That in itself was not unusual. Iron held the chill of the earth. But this was a different cold, a cold that seemed to radiate outward, and when Aldric placed his hand against the marker, he felt it vibrate with a low, almost subsonic hum. "No," he whispered. He dropped to his knees and examined the earth around the post. There, a crack in the ground, barely visible in the failing light, running from the marker toward the barrow itself. And seeping from that crack was a thin tendril of mist, blacker than the fog, moving with distinct purpose. Aldric's heart hammered against his ribs. In 23 years, he had seen the markers weaken, had reinforced them with his own blood and will, but he had never seen one crack, never seen the darkness beneath leak through. He worked quickly, pulling items from his satchel. Salt first, poured in a circle around the cracked earth. Then iron filings, sprinkled over the salt. Then words, old words in a language he had learned from dusty books, words that tasted of ash and time on his tongue. The black mist recoiled, writhing like something alive, and for a moment he thought he had succeeded. But then the crack widened with a sound like grinding stone, and the mist poured forth in greater volume. And with it came a voice. "Keeper," it whispered, and the word was like the rasp of dead leaves across stone. "Keeper, we remember you." Aldric stumbled backward, his staff raised defensively. In all his years, the things in the barrows had never spoken to him. They moaned, they wailed, they screamed in wordless anguish, but they did not speak. "What are you?" he demanded, though his voice shook. The mist coalesced, taking a vague shape, the suggestion of a human figure, bent and twisted. "We are the forgotten," it said, "the buried, the betrayed, and we have waited so long in the dark, Keeper, so very long, so very long." "You cannot leave the barrows," Aldric said, clutching at the words of the old texts like a drowning man clutching at driftwood. "The bindings hold. They have always held." "Bindings weaken," the thing whispered. Time erodes all things, even ancient oaths. We feel the world changing above us. We feel the wards failing. And soon, Keeper, soon we will be free. Not while I live, Aldric said, and he brought his staff down hard on the cracked earth. Silver caps on both ends of the rowan wood struck the ground, and light flared, not bright, but steady, pushing back the darkness. The mist shrieked and withdrew, sucked back into the crack like water down a drain. Aldric didn't wait. He pulled a stoppered vial from his satchel, his own blood, collected and preserved for emergencies, and poured it over the crack. Then he pressed his palm against the iron marker and spoke the words of binding, words that cost something each time they were spoken, taking a piece of his strength and weaving it into the enchantment. The crack sealed. The hum in the iron faded. The unnatural cold receded. But Aldric remained kneeling on the ground, breathing hard, his hand still pressed against the marker. He felt hollowed out, emptied, and he knew with terrible certainty that this was just the beginning. The next 3 nights were quiet, but it was the quiet of a held breath, the silence before a storm. Aldric barely slept. He walked his circuit twice each night instead of once, checking and rechecking the markers. He reinforced 3 others that showed signs of stress, spending more of his blood and his will with each working. On the 4th night, they came. Not from 1 barrow, but from 7. 7 of the largest mounds scattered across the hills. As the fog rolled in and darkness fell, lights began to glow within those ancient tombs. Not the pale corpse lights that sometimes flickered in the hills, but a steady, sickly green luminescence that shone through cracks in the earth and through the stones themselves. And with the light came the voices. They did not speak words, not at first. They simply called, a sound that was part moan, part song, utterly inhuman, yet horribly familiar. It was the sound of longing, of hunger, of endless years spent in darkness, yearning for the light. Aldric stood outside his cottage, staff in hand, and felt fear settle over him like a shroud. This was beyond anything in the records, beyond anything the previous keepers had faced. The dead were waking, and waking in numbers. He could run. The thought came unbidden, seductive in its simplicity. He could take his horse, ride south, leave the hollow hills behind forever. Let someone else deal with this. Let the problem be someone else's burden. But even as he thought it, he knew he wouldn't, couldn't, because he knew what would happen if the barrows opened, if what lay buried there walked free. He had read the old accounts, the fragments of history from the time before the barrows were sealed. He knew what those ancient warriors had become in death, twisted by the very darkness they had once fought. If they rose, they would not stop at the hills. They would spread like a plague, and the living would suffer for it. So Aldric did the only thing he could. He walked into the fog toward the nearest glowing barrow, toward the king's mound where the voice had first spoken to him, and he prepared to do what he had sworn to do 23 years ago. He would keep the watch. The entrance to the king's barrow was sealed with a stone slab that must have weighed as much as 3 horses. It had been set there by the original builders, fitted so perfectly that no light should have escaped. Yet tonight, green luminescence leaked around its edges, and the stone itself trembled with a slow, rhythmic, pulse-like breathing. Aldric placed his hand against the cold stone and felt the power contained within. Not dead, but dormant, or so it had been. Now something stirred, something vast and old and filled with malice. "I know you can hear me," Aldric said, his voice steady despite the fear coiling in his gut. "I am the Keeper. I hold the wards. You cannot pass." The stone went still beneath his palm. Then, slowly, that voice came again, the same one that had spoken from the crack in the earth. "The Keeper," it mused, and Aldric heard something like amusement in its tone. "You are not the first to hold that title. We have known many keepers over the long years. They all grow old, Keeper. They all grow weak, and they all, eventually, die." "And yet the wards have held," Aldric replied. "For now." The voice was patient, almost gentle. "But you feel it, don't you? The weight of your duty, the loneliness, the slow erosion of your will with every passing season. You are human, Keeper. You have limits." Aldric didn't reply. There was nothing to say, because the thing was right. He did feel it, the exhaustion that went deeper than flesh, the weariness that no amount of rest could cure. "We can offer you something," the voice continued. "We can offer you rest, true rest, an end to your burden. Simply step aside, lower the wards, let us pass, and when we walk free, we will grant you the peace you have earned." For a moment, just a heartbeat, just a single drawn breath, Aldric was tempted. The promise of rest, of an end to the watching and the waiting, was almost overwhelming in its appeal. But then he thought of the villages in the lowlands. He thought of the children who played in streets of cobblestone, of the farmers who worked their fields, of ordinary people living ordinary lives, unaware that their safety depended on one tired man refusing to give in. "No," he said quietly. The stone shuddered, and the green light flared brighter. "Then you will break eventually," the voice said, and now there was anger in it. "Tonight, or tomorrow night, or a year from now, you will break, and we will be free." "Perhaps," Aldric acknowledged, "but not tonight." He drew a piece of silver chalk from his satchel and began to mark symbols on the stone wards. Within wards, layers of protection drawn from a dozen different traditions. His hand moved with practiced precision, even as the stone grew hot beneath his touch, even as the thing within the barrow pressed against the barrier with mounting fury. When he finished, he stepped back and spoke the words of sealing one more time, investing them with everything he had left. The symbols flared bright as new stars, then sank into the stone, becoming part of it. The green light within the barrow dimmed. The voice fell silent, but Aldric knew it was only a temporary reprieve. He walked to each of the other 6 barrows that night, reinforcing their seals, fighting exhaustion with every step. By the time dawn broke over the hills, painting the fog with shades of gold and rose, he was barely able to stand. He stumbled back to his cottage, collapsed into his chair by the fire, and for the first time in 23 years, he wept. Not from fear, though fear was there. Not from despair, though despair lurked close. He wept from the simple weight of understanding that this was his life now, and would be until his life ended. There would be no relief, no replacement, no rest. The wards required a keeper, and he was the only one who knew the workings well enough to maintain them. He was the last keeper, and when he died, the barrows would open. But that was a problem for another day. For now, the watch continued. The pattern repeated itself over the following weeks. Each night the barrows would stir. Each night Aldric would walk his circuit, reinforcing the wards, spending his strength and his blood to maintain the boundaries. And each night the thing in the king's barrow would speak to him, patient and persistent, offering rest and peace in exchange for surrender. Aldric stopped answering. There was nothing to say. He knew he was dying. Not quickly, but inevitably, burning himself out like a candle to fuel the wards. On a night when the first snow of winter began to fall, Aldric sat at his table and wrote what he believed would be his final journal entry. "To whoever finds this record," he wrote, his hand cramping around the pen, "know that I have done what I could. The wards hold for now, but they weaken. I have no successor, no apprentice to pass this duty to. When I fall, the barrows will open within days, perhaps hours. I have failed in this, failed to find and train someone to continue the watch. I thought there would be more time. There is never enough time. But I have bought years of peace for the people of the lowlands. They will never know my name. They will never know what was kept at bay while they slept safely in their beds. And that is as it should be. This was never about glory or recognition. It was simply about doing what needed to be done. I am not brave. I am simply stubborn, and perhaps that has been enough. The wind is rising. The dead are restless tonight. I must walk the circuit one more time. If you are reading this, I am gone. May you have better fortune than I did. May you find the strength to do what must be done. The watch must not end." He signed his name, closed the journal, and stood, though it cost him to do so. Then he took up his staff, wrapped himself in his heavy cloak, and stepped out into the snow. The fog was waiting for him, and within the fog, The lights of the barrows glowed brighter than they ever had before. Aldric walked toward them one last time. What happened that night, no one knows for certain. The people of the lowlands reported seeing lights in the hollow hills, great flashes like lightning, but colored wrong, shifting between green and silver and blue. They heard sounds that might have been thunder, or might have been something else, something that made dogs howl and children cry out in their sleep. And then, just before dawn, everything went quiet. When a party from the nearest village finally mustered the courage to investigate 3 days later, they found the cottage intact. Aldric's journal lay on the table, his final entry the last words he had written. His staff leaned in the corner, the silver caps at each end blackened and twisted as if by great heat. His satchel lay empty by the hearth. But of Aldric himself there was no sign. The barrows stood silent beneath fresh snow. The fog had dispersed. The unnatural cold had lifted. And when the villagers approached the markers with trepidation, they found them solid and whole, with no cracks in the earth, no signs of disturbance. The king's barrow, largest of all the mounds, bore fresh marks, symbols carved deep into the stone slab that sealed its entrance, glowing faintly with their own light. Symbols no one in the party could read, but which filled them with a sense of profound relief nonetheless. Whatever had threatened to break free had been stopped. Whatever Aldric had done in his final hours, it had been enough. The villagers took his journal back with them, and the Council of Elders read it with growing horror and understanding. They had known, in an abstract way, that someone watched the hills, but they had not known the cost. They had not known what was kept at bay. They debated what to do. Some argued for finding a new keeper, training someone to take up the duty. Others suggested that perhaps the threat had ended with whatever Aldric had done. Still others wanted to simply abandon the region entirely, leave the hills to whatever dwelt there. In the end, they did what people often do when faced with uncomfortable truths. They chose to forget. Within a generation, the story of Aldric Thorne became a legend. Within 2, it was barely remembered at all. The cottage fell into ruin, the path to the hills became overgrown, and the hollow hills returned to being what they had always been, a place the people of the lowlands knew better than to tread. But on certain nights, when the fog rolls in thick and the wind carries strange voices, travelers who have lost their way sometimes report seeing a figure walking among the barrows. A tall man in a heavy cloak, leaning on a staff, making his eternal circuit of the boundary stones. They say he does not acknowledge those who call out to him. He simply walks, patient and tireless, keeping his vigil. The watch, it seems, did not end after all. And perhaps it never will. For in the hollow hills, where the dead do not rest easy and time moves strangely, some duties transcend death itself. Some oaths bind deeper than flesh and bone, and some watchers keep their posts long after mortal life has fled, sustained by nothing more than stubborn will and the knowledge that someone must stand between the darkness and the light. The barrows remain sealed, the wards hold strong, and somewhere in the fog and shadow, Aldric Thorne walks still, faithful unto death and beyond. The last keeper and the eternal one. And that is the end of this tale. Or perhaps it is only the beginning of a longer story, one that will not end until the world itself ends, and all the ancient evils are finally laid to rest. But that is a story for another night, when the fire burns low and the darkness presses close, and brave souls gather to remind themselves that even against impossible odds, against loneliness and fear and the slow erosion of hope, there are those who will not yield. There are those who keep the watch, and so long as they remain, so too remains the light.